High school is almost over. You got good grades, but not good enough for a full-ride scholarship, and community college is staring at you, licking its lips. The past 4 years of school were brutal enough, and you struggle to outline a reasonable life plan to your parents. They fold their arms, tap their toe, and check their watches, a resentment building within them that your 18th year is approaching, and you don't seem to be ready to leave the nest. You want to take advantage of your newfound freedom after graduation, and spending another 4 years in school crippling yourself financially while having no idea what you want to do doesn't sound like the smartest plan, despite being pushed in that direction by every single responsible person in your orbit. The military isn't an option because you're not physically fit to serve, and on top of that, you'd be too frightened to go through with such a commitment anyway. That freedom you yearn for would be even further stifled by having your every hour regimented by an arm of the United States military. In school, you were a bit of a weird loner. You had one or two close-ish friends, but they always seemed more interested in hanging out with other people, and you could never really open up to them. You were interested in a wide variety of political topics and enjoyed discussing ideas with people, even if the ideas themselves were uncomfortable to think about or contentious in general. This made you off-putting to people. You wanted this connection with someone, but whenever you reached out, you were met with confused glances and awkward laughs, followed by a quick change of subject. There must be people out there like you. A scattered diaspora of introverted, politically inclined people that also had an unanswered desire for debating what you used to call the serious questions. You don't really go out much, but you watch a lot of content that's posted to the internet, and spend most of your free time on YouTube. Much of the time you don't actively engage, but you listen to people like you talk about things while you're cleaning the apartment or taking the subway to another job interview, and you begin to think that you might have something valuable to contribute. That thought gets put out of your mind at first, because obviously, who are you to put your voice out there? These people have thought things through way more extensively than you ever have. What's the point? Your parents keep asking about how the interviews went, and you think they went pretty well, but even for menial jobs, it doesn't appear that you're getting calls back. Just then, an idea flashes into your head. The people you listen to online that post about politics regularly receive donations from their audience. You might be able to kill two birds with one stone here. Find a community that welcomes you, understands you, and eventually provides for you to think and speak about your interests and ideas. So you explain to your parents that you'll continue to look for a job, but on the side, you'll start posting on YouTube to see if it goes anywhere. They roll their eyes and insist that looking for a job is your top priority. And so long as creating content doesn't interfere with that, you're free to start. You manage to find a job working in a thrift shop, sorting through the old donated clothes that come through. You listen to audiobooks written by political philosophers and historians while you work to ensure that you have some sort of foundation to work from, and you genuinely begin to formulate what you think, feel, and believe as an independent person about these big questions. After a few months of posting content and interacting with larger political communities, you start to gain a little bit of a following. It's not much, but it's enough to net you about $200 a month. And with the money you've saved from your thrift store job, it gives you enough for first, last, and security on an apartment. After you move out and set up your studio in your studio, you discover a trend forming. It seems like the more passionate you are about a given topic, the more money comes in. The more aggressive you are, the more people rally behind you. It would be nice to eventually quit your job and make content full-time. Besides, you don't necessarily need to say anything you don't agree with in order to ham it up a little bit for the camera. Maybe instead of saying, might be a good idea to, you throw in an imperative. Maybe instead of saying misinformed, you say stupid. Instead of missing the forest for the trees, you say, get your head out of your ass. This really gets things going. Comments start rolling in about how this is a breath of fresh air and that you are finally saying what everyone is thinking. You'll realize later that the folks in the comments are living vicariously through your words. They wish that they could say this to people in their real lives, but they can't, and so they rely on you for a sort of political catharsis, where they don't need to be respectful or put on airs for those around them. They use you to laugh at and ridicule their loved ones over their political beliefs in secret. Eventually, you say something aggressive that your audience doesn't agree with. You assume that they value your aggression and passion, but in reality they were using you as a conduit for something else. You're almost making enough to quit your job after a few years. You're 21 now. Do you walk it back? Do you ignore it? Does the retention of an audience or your beliefs matter more? Obviously the beliefs matter more, but that damn day job is so labor-intensive and takes away from effort you could be spending making much more high-quality content. You try to ride the line and say something like, I understand why people were so upset about how aggressive I was. I still believe what I believe, but I'm not one to shy away from criticism. I appreciate you guys even if we end up disagreeing. Maybe it's time for me to change my tone a little. The replies are mixed. Some say that they're happy that you're receptive to their feedback. Some of them say you're a coward that's sucking off his bitchy fans because they got mad at you for disagreeing with them in that classic you fashion. That sour pang of restriction that you felt in high school is back once again, as is the resentment. You discover that keeping these people happy is part of the job. It was too good to be true, thinking that being an online political commentator would have no significant drawbacks. You end up riding out that scandal, losing some of the people that admired your brashness, but gaining in steam as other political creators take note of you. They shout you out in their videos and on various other social media platforms, and you notice your follower and viewer base growing day by day. And you feel like you're contributing something valuable to these people, and as a result, the world. Your subscriber count goes up. 2,500, 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, 50,000, 75,000, 100,000. People tune in from all across the earth now to hear your thoughts about current affairs. Donations start rolling in because you're providing something unique. Either your writing or speaking cadence is compelling. Perhaps you've started to learn about video editing so the visuals are more captivating while you speak. Perhaps you're a skilled interviewer and end up having fun and contentious conversations with other more prominent figures that drag you into the limelight via their coattails. As you start to get more popular, though, you notice that you are having responsibilities thrust upon you that you are not ready for. People start expecting you to know everything, to have an opinion about everything, to say everything the right way. They speak of your power and influence while you rant into a microphone in your kitchen. The world is speaking about you too, as opposed to the previous safety of an unknown you speaking about it without it being able to reply. Now it speaks of you loudly and harshly. Every movement and punctuation mark of yours is now run through a meticulous screening process. Your every hypocrisy, inconsistency, insensitive or incorrect statement will be center stage for all to see and treated with the seriousness of a murder trial. No matter where you are or what phase of life you are in, you start to feel always as if you're sitting in a defendant's chair, all alone, without any idea what you've done. Surrounded by people with angry faces, waiting in silence, and wondering what you could possibly say for yourself. Now, regardless of circumstance, your every hiccup might lead you to the cold, splintered wood of that seat. Many of your fans start relying on you for their thoughts on all things political. And if you're wrong, or change your mind, it feels like something of a betrayal, like you opened them up to look stupid. They pay you money so that this wouldn't happen. All of your relationships in the field are ambiguous and on shaky ground. You don't know whether they're friendships or business relationships, and a criticism of a friend or business partner can lead to a loss of income, and that's treated as a betrayal as well. However, refusing to criticize a friend or business partner can also be seen as a betrayal of your principles if you are passionately against certain things during your fiery ascent. Even if you did change your mind, it would look cynical and self-serving. You must make a choice. Criticize them and stay true to a persona that you unwittingly invented for yourself when you were young and immature, or stay silent and be widely tarred as an unforgivable hypocrite now that you're popular. All of your friends and business partners are looking at you and asking themselves the same questions. You're getting even more popular, so you quit your job as you planned. You've surrendered your income. You've stopped making content because you're passionate about it. Now you're making content because you have to in order to maintain whatever ideal fans and creators have in their minds of you just to stay afloat. Eventually, you abandon most of your agency to this storm. The money, the relationships, focusing on being politically consistent, caveating every statement to avoid hostile accusations, fending off convincing lies of people that hate you, the desperate attempts to meld the real you with the persona you show to people online. You start to do this stuff on autopilot until you realize what you've done. You let yourself get thrown into the pit of a coliseum made of eggshells, where you're expected to both fight and not break anything. All you wanted to do at the start was find other misfits like you. But now they're all in the pit with you, and your lives depend on surviving in it. Someone publicly eviscerates you for pushing an eggshell toward their foot after they stab someone else for stepping on one. The crowd hisses and boos at you. Another misfit is sliced down the middle and tries to wriggle his detached torso away from the brittle shells, and the crowd laughs. You laugh along with them out of panic. You throw a knife at someone and it sticks into their chest. The crowd cheers. The crowd is splitting now. They're allowed to revere you or spit on you over whatever they please, whenever they please. You unknowingly made yourself the star of a bloody reality TV freak show. The freedom is all gone. Your only option is to keep on contorting yourself to the roar of the crowd. Your public reputation has already been defined by the time you've spent in the pit. There's nowhere else you can go in this field aside from obscurity. You know what you would do different, but it's too late now. They love you, then they hate you, then they forget you, then they laugh at you, then they love you, then they're indifferent about you. They push and pull their dollar bills in and out of your throat depending on whether or not you live up to whatever expectation they demand of you at any given moment, which you naively helped to reinforce when you were young, lonely, and full of hope. If you quit, you're back to being that weird loner with no one to talk to, and all the existential pain that coincides with feeling so deeply alone, boring, and average. The strings are being tied around your wrists now, then the ankles, the neck, and all the while you keep smiling convincingly. Say thank you for the donation, and let them know that you're just happy that they're watching. 4 years ago, after I graduated high school, I was living in a rundown apartment by myself, a long way from my old town. One of the windows in the kitchen was smashed and covered loosely with a trash bag. It's been like that for months after some kid hurled a brick through it for fun. I was too nervous to call the landlord and have an argument with him about how it actually got broken. Losing the apartment meant owing him money I didn't have. One of the only pieces of furniture I owned was a sofa I found on the side of the road, with a cardboard sign that read "Free" stuck between the cushions and backrest. In addition, I had a fridge, a stove with those flimsy metal coils for burners, a mattress on the floor, a small desk, microwave, rickety chair, and a huge old box TV. The kind you still needed to slap the side of to clear up a wobbly image and sweep away the static. I survived on nothing but hot dogs, ramen, and frozen vegetables. Spent most of my time in the apartment when I wasn't working, vegging out in front of the television, trying to pretend I wasn't actually living in this dump, that I wasn't on a collision course toward a lackluster life. When the TV wasn't working, I would stumble through the memories of high school with both fondness and terror. There never appears to be an average day in the life of the average teenager. Poring over my memories, it seemed as if each day was either amazing or terrible. But I suppose trimming that fat is what the mind does automatically. I was a bit of a weird kid in high school. I had an innocent-looking face and a knack for social mimicry. I could get along fine with everyone, but it was very difficult for me to develop intimate friendships. I was a new kid as a freshman, but everyone at this particular high school had gone to middle school together, as it was located in the same building. It was a rural area, which worried me even more. Everybody must already know everybody, and I'd be the only person who didn't. Luckily, I met my two best friends, David and Jeremy, the very first morning of my high school career. Maybe I walked in looking frightened. Maybe I just looked confused. I saw Jeremy point at me from one of the lunch tables where everyone was gathering before our first class. "You!" he said to me. I ignored him because I was sure he was trying to get the attention of someone behind me. He repeated himself with more fanfare in his voice. "You! Black shirt, cargo pants, come over here, sit down." I followed his instructions and sat down at the table where he and a bunch of other kids were already sitting. He introduced me to everyone, and I introduced myself back. Half of the table was ignoring us, because I know now that this is just how Jeremy tends to be all the time. He put his arm around me, put his other arm around the boy sitting on the opposite side of him, and with as much confidence as someone proclaiming that the sun will rise, Jeremy said, with no room for argument, "You, me, Dave, we're gonna be best friends the entire fucking time we're in this place." And it was so. My phone buzzed. I hadn't gotten a text in 6 days. I thought it was my mother doing her weekly checking up on me, but it turns out the message was from Dave. It had been years since we last spoke to each other. Nothing hard feelings related. Nature took its course when I moved out of town again. You try to keep in touch for a while, but then you forget. Then you get busy, and then you get too tired to deal with anything that doesn't involve your basest functions. Old friends prioritize each other less and less until eventually they've not spoken for so long it feels strange to start a conversation that doesn't acknowledge the absence. I opened the message and it said, "Jeremy died." My ribs turned to lead and I called him. "Hey man," Dave said, trying to keep his composure. "Hey," I responded. "So, yeah, I guess it happened yesterday," he said. "What happened?" I asked. "Bad batch of heroin. Wanted one last hurrah before finally doing that computer science program he kept talking about," Dave said. "I thought he kicked the stuff," I said. "We all did," he said. I looked up at my ceiling and sighed. Fucking idiot. He was sleeping over Wyatt's house and he had some on him. Took the opportunity. Never woke up. Found cold on the couch. I stammered. Okay. When's the service?" I asked. "Sunday, 3 p.m. Need a ride? Place to stay?" he asked. "Ride? No. Place to stay? Yeah," I said. "I'm still living with my mom, but I'm sure she'll be happy to see you," he said, trying to talk about anything else. "Yeah, man. I'll head over now," I said. After an uncomfortable farewell, I got in my car and started driving. Memories of Jeremy flooded into my brain as if a dam had burst. The three of us did nearly everything together, but I was closer to David than I was to Jeremy. David was closer to Jeremy than he was to me. I remember getting Jeremy's older brother to sell us miniature apple-flavored cigars when we were freshmen, and weaving through the woods around David's house talking about whatever popped into our heads at any given moment. I remember we had this stupid inside joke about the mesothelioma commercials that bombarded basic cable back then. "Everybody better watch out for that mesothelioma," he'd say. "Lock your doors, pal, or else mesothelioma will come and get you," Literally rip you limb from limb. It's not that funny now. Lots of jokes sour into embarrassment when you grow older, but it was hilarious at the time. On numerous occasions, I'd be in my apartment and the commercial would air. I'd reach for my phone to text Jeremy and say, "Hey man, guess what was just on?" But every single time I'd put the phone down and think it had been way too long since we last connected, and trying to open up with a crass cancer joke instead of a groveling explanation as to why I hadn't contacted him for such a lengthy period of time might offend him. The three of us had our first drink together too. We started a fire in Dave's fire pit one summer weekend after sophomore year. We sat in 3 folding lawn chairs in front of the fire listening to the coals crackle. When I would look up, a tangle of tree branches slithered through the evening sky. There wasn't much light pollution. On particularly good nights, we could faintly make out the splatter of the Milky Way. It was beautiful all the same. David went inside without saying a word and brought back 3 half-empty plastic cups filled with a deep brown liquid. He told us that this was coffee-flavored brandy. All 3 of us thought it tasted terrible, but we all pretended we loved it and tried to comment on the subtle flavors of the liquor like we'd been there before. Jeremy would usually try to do something funny and dangerous, like putting way too much wood on or setting the end of a small stick on fire and waving it around like a torch. He made these nights around the fire a little less somber and serious, despite my and David's attempts to talk about life, girls, future job prospects, philosophical questions, issues, our parents or siblings, anything, really. Whenever the conversation would get beyond a certain threshold of heavy, Jeremy would chime in with a joke, or change the subject entirely. Eventually, though, he opened up a little bit, and over time we got him to join us in our juvenile quest to understand everything. Jeremy made life feel a little bit more free. Whenever any of us had a major life issue, we'd plan to meet in David's backyard, start a fire, and ramble on about it. We couldn't fix it, but we'd talk. Jeremy never told us about his drug problem. We knew he took drugs, even some of the harder stuff, but we didn't know that it had become a problem. There were clues that the both of us should have picked up on. Start hanging around certain kinds of people. Start wearing long-sleeve shirts and jeans in the summer. Having to leave early because he was getting sick. My worst memory of Jeremy is the morning after a sleepover we had at David's house. Dave had an elderly dog with hip problems, and so every day at dinner, he'd need to put its pain pill inside of a piece of food and trick the poor gal into eating it. David's mom discovered that some of the pills went missing and immediately accused Jeremy of taking them. Jeremy defended himself against this particular accusation, but coincidences like this had already piled up over the years, and his arguments started straining credulity. I arrived at David's house. We greeted each other, started a fire, cracked a couple beers, and sat in our traditional lawn chairs, now shredded with holes by time and use. David was a quiet guy, reserved. He never went off on a tangent. Preferred to speak in body language whenever he could get away with it. "How you holding up?" I asked. "As much as I can," he responded. He picked up a long piece of wood and started poking the coals around. It was clear that he didn't want to talk about it. He just needed somebody to watch his back in the dark while he rifled through his own memories, and I was willing to do that for him. The fire was near to smoldering out when he got up and started walking inside. "If you're going to stay up, make sure it's out. Couch is all yours." "All right," I said. The next day we arrived at the funeral home, but not before driving past the park in the center of town. The nearby lumber mill would gather up a bunch of its scrap wood throughout the year, and then on July 4th, they'd pile it up in the middle of the park and set it ablaze. Almost everybody nearly always went, and everyone acted surprised to see everyone else there despite that fact. They'd end the night with a fireworks show too. The funeral home was a very tiny white building. I saw familiar faces gathered outside, and a couple of them were already crying. I hadn't cried yet. I needed to be a stern face for the others here, and the reality of the situation wasn't quite hitting me yet. I gave a few hugs, and then returned to David's side. "You gonna be alright?" I asked. "Yeah. Let's just go," he replied. We walked through the door and his mother was standing there in the casket room's entryway thanking everyone for coming. To her right were a bunch of prayer cards with Jeremy's face on it, and a bunch of quartz pieces that had been smoothed by ocean waves. I took one of each and put them in my pocket. His mother had been sobbing. When she saw the two of us approach, she ran up and hugged us tightly. "It really means a lot that you boys came," she said. When we finally got inside, there was a long, slow line of old acquaintances and members of his family waiting to pay their respects. The casket was open. David was ahead of me in line. When it was his turn, he walked up, put his hands in his pockets, and stared silently at Jeremy's body. After a couple minutes, he took out the piece of quartz and started rubbing it as he looked inside. Then he walked away to a seat on the right. It was my turn. I walked up to the casket and stared into it. What was inside did not look like Jeremy. While the mortician tries their best, they never can make the dead look like their living selves. It looked like someone had constructed a melting mannequin to resemble my friend and stuck it in a casket. It was the first time I'd ever seen him wear a suit. Except I wasn't actually seeing him wear a suit. Just something dressed up as Jeremy with a suit on it. You hear stories of what someone who overdoses looks like. See it in movies. I saw it once in a nightclub bathroom about a year ago, too. Some stranger was slumped over on the toilet with his pants down. His head was limp against his shoulder and his legs were sliding out from under him. The needle flopped carelessly from his inner elbow, barely clinging to the underside of the skin. It pained me to imagine that man with Jeremy's face. David almost broke down during the eulogy, but he managed to get through it. Everyone retreated to the parking lot and the pallbearers loaded his body into the hearse, signaling the beginning of the procession. We both got into David's car, and as soon as the doors were closed, he started pounding his fist into the steering wheel, screaming obscenities in a cracked voice with each hit. "I'm gonna find these guys. These fucking dealers. That fucking scumbag that gave it to I don't give a shit. They can kill me if I don't get the right jump on them, but they've got to pay for this. Somebody's got to pay for this. This can't just be a goddamn whoopsie-daisy," David said as he started the car. I grabbed his arm before we could get rolling. "Don't do that," I said. I don't give a shit. I'm shooting every single one of these fuckers in the teeth. Whoever sold it to that jerk-off and the jerk-off himself. David wailed through heaving sobs. "Don't make me lose two friends, man," I said. David was angry and vengeful. He'd grown wings of righteous fire. I needed to physically restrain him until he calmed down and promised me that he wouldn't go through with it whenever I ended up leaving. David broke down for a few minutes, and I gave him a little while to get it all out. "Come on, man. He needs us there," I said. "Yeah," he said. After the ceremony at the funeral, each of us put our little handful of dirt over the casket after it was lowered into the ground. His parents were crying. Our former classmates were all red-eyed and wiping their noses. But still, I couldn't bring myself to tears. David and I went back to his house after sitting around the hole in the earth where our best friend was going. We were the last ones there aside from his parents, and they asked us if we wouldn't mind letting them have some alone time with their son. We respectfully said our goodbyes. That night, we had another fire in David's yard, but set up an empty lawn chair between us in honor of Jeremy. Neither of us said a word to each other all evening. We spent the entire time getting lost in the whips of the flame, the majesty of the clear night sky, and the booze. Occasionally, one of us would notice the fire was getting low and throw another log on, or we'd reach into the cooler to grab another drink. But other than that, only the sporadic pop from the fire and the constant music of crickets lit up our ears. I still hadn't cried. "Okay, going to bed. See you tomorrow," David said as he got up and walked back inside. I sprayed the logs with his garden hose and went to bed as well. I left the next morning after making sure Dave didn't need me to stay another day. I drove home and entered my sordid kitchen once again. I passed by the shattered window, sat down on the ragged sofa, and turned the TV on. I started to worry that Dave didn't think I was taking this hard enough, but I very much was. It haunted my mind for the next few nights, and I could barely sleep. Was I truly this callous? Have I been so worn down by the few years of independent life I'd lived I can't bring myself to cry at my best friend's funeral? After work, around a week later, I came home, put a hot dog in a stale bun and microwaved it. I plopped down on my sofa, cracked a beer, and turned the TV on, as was my routine, getting ready to enjoy a night full of mind-erasing programming. The commercial came on for the law firm that specializes in cases surrounding the contraction of mesothelioma. I chuckled to myself, reached for my phone, and then I wept. I wept like a goddamn baby. Hi, where to start? I'm here against my will. My wife insists that I take a little while to work on myself before we end up having children together. I've been to 6 other practitioners, and none of them have given me anything like what I'm looking for. I'm not sure I even need anything, aside from being told to play the cards I've been dealt. I don't think you'll be able to tell me anything about myself that I haven't already discovered through all of the grueling rumination that forces itself on me. Sometimes, when I'm about to start my shift at work, I experience an intense bout of nausea, and usually end up throwing up a few times. I know from where my problem stems. In lieu of you speaking and interrupting me, I'd respectfully request that you let me deliver this presentation and for you to save your comments for the end. I feel this weight wherever I go. Stronger than gravity. It's like everything within me is denser than it ought to be. But when the weight lets up, the jitters arrive, and I have the overwhelming urge to cut away from everyone and everything. It's as if I'm being held beneath the water, the palm of someone's hand crushing the top of my head and submerging it in a murky pond. I hold my breath and it's painful. The desire to open my mouth and inhale will nearly overtake my instinct for survival. On the cusp of such an action, though, without fail, the pressure will let up, and I will rise above the water and gulp down a long, satisfying breath of fresh air, only to be instantly shoved back into the depths. I can't express this burden to anyone else, for fear that this cycle is just the baseline of what life consists of. And who likes to be around someone complaining about what we all have to go through by the mere act of being? The arm which pushed me under is attached to my father, and my issues likely stem from a series of incidents in my boyhood. He was a strict man, a man with strong values that he refused to live by in his private life, but had no issue exemplifying while in public. When I was 6 years old, he saw that me and my younger brother hadn't made our beds properly. He called us upstairs and told us if we didn't correctly fold one of the blankets on the floor in 20 seconds, perfectly, we would have to do a set of 10 push-ups. Now keep in mind, it seems rather achievable, but we're dealing with a 6- and 4-year-old here. Needless to say, we failed. We failed over and over again until our arms started giving out, with my dad making passive-aggressive comments throughout the process. Jesus, you really having this much trouble with a blanket, guys? All right, drop for another 10. Things like that. I became so frustrated with my brother that I yelled at him to just let me do it. He was small and slow, and my arms were so unbelievably tired. He didn't deserve that, but the rage shot out of my mouth anyway. My father then grabbed me by both my shoulders, lifted me off the ground, and pinned me against the wall. He screamed at me for yelling at my little brother. Whenever he was angry, his face would go red, his eyes would narrow, and the veins in his forehead would form a Y shape while he was accosting us for something or other. I got stellar grades. My siblings not so much. My sister Maddie was the youngest of us and had the most trouble, was barely passing. I don't know whether passing or failing necessarily matters in elementary school, though. My younger brother Ben was a solid BC student. Me, the oldest, was sitting pretty with a 4.0 GPA. I remember the bus ride home after receiving my first B. It was in U.S. history, freshman year. The trip home felt far quicker than usual. Time has a tendency to flow the opposite speed one wants. I stared at my report card in horror of what he might do when he saw it. Every possibility went through my head. He could start throwing things at me, shout at me, ground me, hit me, even kill me. When we all got home, our dad was sitting at the kitchen table reading a newspaper, his glasses draped out over his nostrils. I took a deep breath and got in line behind Ben and Maddie, and accepted that I was going to be made a rag doll for the rest of the day. Maddie and Ben had improved their marks. Maddie had gone from failing all of her classes to passing all of them with D's and C's. Ben had gone from 3 B's and 3 C's to 5 B's and 1 C. High fives and congratulations all around. I handed my report card to him. He studied it intensely for a few moments, took his glasses off, and then pinched the bridge of his nose. "What's this B all about?" he asked me. I stammered. "Some pop quiz you didn't tell me about? Homework assignment missed? What, you just got a B for no reason?" He interrogated further. No, I don't think so," I said. "Whatever. I don't have the energy for this right now." "Fix it," he said, snapping his fingers and pointing at the paper. I let out a sigh of relief after we all returned to our room. His standards were impossible to maintain. The moment you pass one milestone, or reach a certain height of achievement, it in effect becomes the new standard. Reasoning all of it out now, I can see the ridiculousness of it, but at the time it felt like a permanent state of perpetual failure. I was convinced that if I were an artist and had painted the Sistine Chapel, my father would then demand my every wayward doodle be just as magnificent, or else I was getting lazy. I was responsible for my siblings while my parents were at work, which was nearly every day. From 6 a.m. until 6 p.m., I was in charge of keeping 2 young troublemakers in line. Their mistakes became my mistakes, considering I was responsible for them. And if I were being responsible, they wouldn't be in the position to make such mistakes. This scheme of rules turned the lot of us, even my mother, into pathological liars for a time. I learned all of the intricacies of the well-crafted lie. Every parameter must be accounted for, or else he'd find it and begin an aggressive cross-examination. He would tell us, "Listen, if you lie to me, it's going to be much worse." But it wasn't. The truth and the lie got the same treatment. Allow me to give an example. My sister wanted to skip school one day. I sent my brother off to the bus stop by himself while I tried to reason with her, but she kept telling me that she had an idea. The rule in the house was if we didn't have a fever and weren't puking, we were to attend school. My dad needed photo confirmation of the vomit or a picture of the thermometer in our mouth with a reading of over 100 degrees. I wanted to just run off to school. I wasn't sure which was more irresponsible, leaving my youngest sister in the house alone and missing school, or letting my brother go off to the bus stop on his own. She gathered up a couple of eggs, a can of vegetable soup, a bunch of potato chips, cookies, and orange juice. She tossed them into the blender, dumped it out into the toilet, and then took a picture of it and sent it to our father. I called him and asked him what I should do. He told me to go to school, that he'd be home early, and asked me to make sure she leaves the doors and windows locked. I did what he told me. After I came home, I noticed that my sister was lying down on the couch playing video games as if nothing was wrong. I immediately ordered her to get a blanket from our room and a large bowl or bucket from the kitchen. I didn't know what early meant, and so I hurried as fast as I could manage. I washed the blender thoroughly and put it away, How would we explain the missing food? She ate it? Why would a sick person be eating this weird assortment of foods? Cookies, eggs? The vegetable soup I can believe, but the potato chips and orange juice? It was a disaster waiting to happen. I hightailed it to the convenience store about a block down the road on my bike with a bunch of change from my piggy bank and purchased replacements for all of the missing food items. I took 2 eggs from the new carton, put them in the old one, and discarded the new one. I did the same with the cookies. The orange juice I needed to dump down the sink so that it was filled to the exact same level as the previous orange juice, and then discarded the other bottle. A similar process took place for each of the ingredients in my sister's vomit concoction, until it appeared that nothing whatsoever had changed. Everything was then hidden in a trash bag and brought outside to the bin. It was on this level of subtlety and precision that I was operating daily. Each of my movements being judged for consistency. My eyes must open from sleep the right way. I must breathe properly. If only I could have bent and stretched myself into the perfect shape, then maybe he would have loved me for a second. He can never know this, but if I had known that there was a glorious, glowing attaboy at the end of it, I'd probably put myself through it again. I wasn't the only recipient, mind you. My father once discovered my younger brother had around 3 weeks' worth of unfinished homework assignments hidden under his bed. I could hear him screaming from downstairs, and so I rushed up to see what was going on. My dad's back was facing me, and he was standing in the doorway to our bedroom. My brother moved his head to the side and shot me an obvious look. A begging, pleading look. The look a cat gives you when it's barely clinging to a thin branch over a swift, deep river. My dad noticed this and turned around. "Get out of here. This isn't your business," he shouted. I did what he told me and took my younger sister outside. She sat in the yard, picked individual blades of grass from the ground and tossed them to the wind. I sat in a chair with tears welling in my eyes, pretending to be engrossed in a book, while the walls of the house muffled my father's screams and my brother's cries. I peeked up from my book for a moment to see, in the second-story window, my father backhanding my brother. When we eventually returned inside, Ben wouldn't speak to me about what just happened. He just looked down at my feet and said that he was going to try and get some of his homework done. The decision not to get between them is still the worst decision I've ever made. I made it out of raw cowardice and deprived him of a partner in his suffering. I don't know how my mother lived with herself, making that choice every single day. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I crept my way into the kitchen and grabbed one of the knives from the block on the counter. I lightly tapped the tip of the blade on my index finger to evaluate how sharp it was. I tested how tightly I could grip the handle and wondered whether or not it could be successfully wrestled away. I held it in a fist with the blade pointed toward the floor and practiced my downward swing. How quick it was. How many times I could stab him before he knew what was happening. I got all the way to the bottom of our staircase and stood there. I was at a precipice. One so dark and so deep that it wasn't possible to see what lurked at the bottom of it. Not even the most radiant light could pierce through and give me an indication of what might await me should I dive straight in. I could sense, peering over that ledge, left a stain on me somewhere. A speck of rot floated up from within the chasm and was sucked into my body during one of my hyperventilations. I walked back into the kitchen and returned the knife to its holster. But the pestilence, which established a colony in my heart, did not disappear afterward. It's a difficult thing, knowing the terrifying secrets of those beloved by the world outside. Knowing the depths to which man can sink before it should be conceivable to you. You start to think you don't know anything anymore. That you're not even human. That even the inevitability of death is nothing but hallucination. This all came to a head when I was 16. I used to have a habit of leaving my towel on the floor of the bathroom when I got out of the shower. I was sitting in a chair in the living room, texting a friend of mine, when I heard his footsteps stomping into the living room. I didn't do anything other than sit there and tense up for whatever was about to happen. He grabbed me by the ankle and pulled me out of the chair. He dragged me into the bathroom by my foot, the back of my head slamming against the small dividers that jutted out of the floor between rooms. "Pick up your fucking towel," he screamed at me. I was shocked to discover that it wasn't my towel sitting there. "It isn't mine," I said. "Isn't your... Well, whose is it then?" he said. From the living room, Maddie piped up and said in a squeaky voice, "Sorry, Dad. That was me," she said. "Oh. All right, then," he said as he let go of my foot and casually strolled into his bedroom as if nothing had happened. The arrogance. The sheer gall of it all. If I couldn't put my foot down here, I never would. I calmly walked back into the living room, picked up my phone from off the floor, and started texting my friend again, as if nothing had happened. Around 20 minutes later, in my father comes, hat in hand. "Hey, I wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't know the towel wasn't yours," he said. "I don't accept your apology," I responded. What do you mean you don't accept my apology? I messed up and I'm telling you I'm sorry," he said, agitated. "And I'm telling you I don't accept your apology," I said, and continued to type away. "What? All right, give me your phone. Give it to me." "Won't accept my apology," he said. I gave it to him and told him that I still wasn't going to accept his apology. He knew that I had him on the ropes. He was absolutely in the wrong, and I was absolutely in the right. And I had, at last, picked the perfect battle. This infuriated him, you see. The argument escalated for a few minutes. For the first time, I raised my voice at him and said, "You can't drag somebody across a fucking house for something they didn't do and expect an apology to fix the whole thing. You just don't fucking do that." Once again, he grabbed me by my shoulders and pinned me up against the nearest wall. I could not let him know that I was afraid of him. Despite my heart racing and my muscles contracting to the point of cramping, I stared him dead in the face. I did not move a single muscle. My eyes had nothing inside them. My lips were relaxed, jaw unclenched, absolutely stone-faced. "Wipe that fucking look off your face," he shouted at me. But there was no look. There was no face. The infection that had taken root within me had spread. And this final confrontation left my heart dry and devoid of all blood and warmth. I transformed myself into an abyss so completely that all he could see was his reflection. I made myself as cold as was necessary to absorb his heat without melting. "Get your fucking hands off my brother!" Ben shouted from behind my mom. I can't tell you precisely what he broke within me that day, but it's not repairable. It will remain broken forever. I hope I broke something within him too. I hope the exhausting ache of the rot eats him when it's hungry. We didn't speak much after that. My mother eventually left him, but then she started to resent me because my nausea issue was making it difficult to hold down a job. I ended up leaving the nest at the ripe old age of 22. When I was a boy, I would read about people who went through great hardship in their youth and went on to do great things. It's not true for most of us. Most of us get through it and then cook food for rowdy assholes in diners serve drunk jackasses their 5th shot of the night, drive for some taxi app or whatever. And every free instant is spent in a movie theater, being shown a feature-length film of the worst moments of your life, with you desperately searching for a convincing way to tell yourself that there was something you could have done. That it means something. That you're entitled to some recompense by a just law of balance for the pain you carried. It's only a small leap from there to romanticizing the despair that dwells within you. Wouldn't want to do that. Suffering, in all its depth, doesn't come with recognition. There's no blue ribbon. There's no attaboy when it's all said and done. It comes with needing to eat and sleep like everyone else. It's getting to experience tedium. Like taking lukewarm showers for the rest of your life after years of ice baths. The pendulum doesn't swing into ecstasy, as one hopes, but instead gets lodged in the safety of the fulcrum. I can't run from these demons. They're everywhere I am. I can't fight them. I'm only hurting myself. I can't outwit them. They know what I'm going to do the same moment I do. All I can do is take their hands, lead them in a long, fine dance, vomit before I go to work, and hopefully, one day, awaken to find myself dancing alone. Time's up? Yeah. Here's my card. The date is August 11th, 2015. My name is Samuel G. Miller, and I've decided to undertake the arduous task of reading through and summarizing the entirety of the Journal of Dr. Francis Coleridge. The journal itself is made up of 17 volumes. Each volume contains on average around 1,500 pages. Dr. Coleridge is said to have documented his life in writing every single day since he developed the ability to write legibly. Thus far, no person in my field of study has had the patience or curiosity to read it in its entirety. I won the entire collection at an auction using what was left of the money I'd saved up for my last couple years of higher education. My justification for this was that while those in my history major were writing theses on exhausted topics like the Battle of Stalingrad, I'd be contributing something to the historical record that had yet to be archived and studied properly. Were these books merely the inane ramblings of an ancient nobleman, I wouldn't be as keen on or dedicated to the completion of this project. But the aura of tragedy that surrounds this manuscript is one that I must admit intrigues me. My contemporaries had nothing but mockery to toss my way after I announced that I was dropping out to pursue the journal, and this includes the staff of my alma mater. They've even gone so far as to tell me that this is a hilarious practice in wasted life. The contempt my colleagues feel towards me is mutual. Despite their suave disdain, I am thoroughly convinced that my work here will be of greater impact than the sum of the work they've done, or ever will do, during the course of their mediocre careers, which they will spend extolling to poor, bored souls that Paul Revere never actually rode around on a horse screaming the British are coming at Puritans and thatch-roof cottages. This investigation into an obscure man is to be my crowning achievement. I am by no means short on time or commitment to the completion of this project. This project is completely without deadline, as I intend to continue until I find that all my inquiries have been answered to my satisfaction. It may seem that I've already become obsessive about this undertaking of mine, but who can resist the allure of reading words that not one other live human being has yet laid eyes on? In the grand scheme of the world, this work is likely meaningless, or at the very least near meaningless, but I find the prospect of being the one to stumble upon any discovery, no matter how minute, the most life-affirming activity for a man of my talents and inclinations. Of what use is history without discovery? Are those with an interest in the past destined to remain stationary and glaze over archives that have already been glazed over by far more discerning and intelligent eyes? Is the finding of fact to be left only to the journalists and scientists? I reject this zeitgeist of historian as mere repetitious bore and embrace the idea of the historian as private eye. Without me, this work's pages may never have stared back into the eyes of one who wished to know its secrets. At the risk of melodrama, I am resurrecting Dr. Coleridge from his death. If the man wrote this so that he might obtain a shred of immortality, it is I who is respecting his wish and ensuring that his life is not forgotten. That is, not forgotten yet. Perhaps it is my immortality that will be ensured via the assurance of another's. It would be dishonest of me to assert that this was not one of my considerations. I realize that this compulsion can be a difficult one to understand. After all, this could be nothing but an old-world medical doctor preening on and on about how stressful his day at work was and how his wife made him his favorite meal. But then again, it may not be something so trivial. The historian is possibly the most underappreciated and most vital organ in our society. History is memory. It delivers to us our past successes and failures. It is difficult to place oneself in reality if one does not have a vision of what's behind them and what may potentially lie ahead of them. It is also this which drives me to this journal. This, quite possibly, is the most documented man to have ever existed before the creation of the Dymaxion chronophile. An oddity such as myself, investigating an oddity such as Dr. Coleridge, can be none other than the subtle machinations of fate curling our threads around one another. That none of my fellow creatures thought this a worthy object of study demonstrates a profoundly disappointing, insouciant attitude. They've forgotten their duty to try to not be amnesiacs, flailing about in a storm of circumstance that they won't bother to comprehend. However, this is not the time for a screed pouring condemnation on academia, no matter how much I might enjoy writing such a thing. Some of my biases have already been laid out for you in the previous paragraphs, and so I will proceed with some initial caveats regarding my research of this journal. Of course, it should be noted that we're dealing with the writings of one person, and it's likely we'll be hearing about his thoughts, feelings, and interpretations of events that have occurred in his life. For the purposes of this book, I'd like to operate under the assumption that whatever Dr. Coleridge says about his life is true, provided that it does not conflict with presently known historical knowledge. Any mutually exclusive facts that may appear in Dr. Coleridge's writing will be treated as untrue until further notice, because it is quite possible that our historical record is inaccurate, but altogether, it's an unlikely turn of events. It should be made clear that Dr. Coleridge's interpretations of events are but one possible interpretation, and my interpretation of his interpretations will place another thin, blurry veil over the truth. Unfortunately, we cannot see into the past with clear eyes, and we must work with what we actually have at our disposal. I will be taking his expressions of his feelings and thoughts as true and sincere, with the usual expectation of exaggeration or embellishment that will naturally overtake a person when they are privately scribbling about themselves. Sadness tends to become despair, contentment tends to become radiant joy, frustration becomes righteous rage. So long as we consistently remember that we are not dealing with an objective rendering of history, we should be able to extract some useful answers about who this man was and the time and place in which he lived. Ultimately, it is my goal to understand this man at the deepest possible level, to know his inner world as well as his outer world, also to make you, dear reader, an expert in all things Dr. Francis Coleridge. I intend to summarize this man and condense his story, but I also wish to lead you through the process. While many of my contemporaries prefer to research, take notes, and then begin writing, I prefer to mesh all three of these processes into one. As I research, I write. I will take you through these books as if you were my own eyes. After the examination and summarizing of each volume in full, I will consult my notepad and deliver my personal thoughts about the section I've summarized, as well as give you some insight into my unconventional processes. As of this moment, I've not turned a single page of the collection. I've read not one word. I may run into difficulties in the telling of this tale due to my self-imposed restrictions, but you should be able to relish in the thrill of learning and revelation along with me. I dare not deprive you of that. Too often, I have viewed the work of the well-respected, to find that their source material consists of naught but the interpretations of others that are well-respected. It's as if the world's events correspond more accurately with reality if we hear them pass through a pair of admired lips. Those I attend school with were plagued in this way, consistently arguing about the validity of interpretations, despite believing that all interpretation is subjective and therefore valid. In one part of their minds, they believed they were engaging in a pointless exercise, and yet decided to dedicate their lives to this meaninglessness. They claim, with their faux enlightened attitude, that our senses can't be trusted, and yet develop instruments using their senses to avert their senses. I find that I feel a similar visceral disgust towards those that don't have a hard enough grip of their own heads and catapult themselves into a world where the unconventional and ignorant is where the hidden truth finds its voice. They lock themselves inside of a cage and refuse to believe anything said by someone with knowledge, and adopt the precepts of bluntly told lies, claiming that they've freed themselves from being brainwashed. Replacing one chain for another, and singing the virtues of their unleashed genius. All of this posturing by my fellow man to avoid accepting that they were wrong about something. The human mind is an odd one. It deludes itself to avoid being wrong. It would rather be more wrong than perceive itself to have been wrong. It would rather believe that wrongness does not exist. This is typical from a creature that fears the unknown, but I reject this fear. I welcome the unknown. I embrace it. The idea of being the first of us to know something is comforting to a degree, because I know that I need not trust anyone else. My eyes, my thoughts, and my fingers will see things directly, read them directly, and be untainted by the explanations of another. It is impossible for you, dear reader, to experience this deep pleasure for yourselves completely. However, I hope to get you as close as possible to this sensation through the medium of text. I should go into detail about the events leading up to this collection ending up in my possession. The previous owner was a book collector whose only hobby was to purchase old books and stash them somewhere. As an amateur book collector myself, I managed to track down who I thought was the owner. I sent her multiple emails and received no response. The same was true of the letters I had sent. I even, against my better judgment, tried showing up to her apartment, but my knocks went unanswered as well. All I could discern from that visit was the unmistakable stench of wet mold, and that her light was on. After hearing of her disappearance, I found where the auctioning of her belongings was taking place. As I entered the building, I had one goal in mind: obtain every volume of the journal. I managed to do so with relative ease. I had a decent budget to work with, and hardly anyone was interested enough in the collection to contest my $21,000 bid. There was no use in trying to get it for a lower price. That would have been far too risky, and I couldn't let this slip away from me. I had already decided that my last couple years of graduate school were of no use to me and my work. Of course, I received strange glances from the other auction goers, but snide eyes are a common occurrence in my life, and I've learned to overcome my worry about them. The books themselves are behemoths. They feel heavier than their weight in paper. I held volume 1 in my right hand, and another large book of similar size and binding in my left hand, and the journal felt at least a few pounds denser. I became even more interested to start this project, but I knew that preliminary work still needed to be done. Attempting to track down the original publisher was a labyrinthine Sisyphean struggle. I contacted everybody I knew, used every online resource imaginable, and couldn't seem to drum up any information on which corporate entity or even person may have put this book out. My internet search regarding any information about the existence of Dr. Francis Coleridge led to similar conclusions. Nothing appeared aside from random, non-credible results from generic ancestry services, obscure blogs where the collection has been mentioned alongside a plethora of fictional legendary books and urban legends, and the mention of the poor man who took his own life while in possession of this collection. Mostly useless information to me. I suppose that I should describe the physical appearance of the books themselves. Some of the books are a mottled patch of tattered tan with lighter and darker splotches of color due to what I can only assume is the result of the typical weathering of leather and paper. Some of them are a dark gray with the same symptoms of age. The rest are what I can only describe as a musty green color, the color of dead lichen or rotting moss. The coloring of each installment of the journal follows no clear pattern that I can discern. Each volume within the collection is bound in the Cambridge style, which only became a popular method of bookbinding in the very early parts of the 18th century. Both covers are bound in standard calfskin and were stained with varying colors. I'm unsure as to what was used to stain the gray and green covers, but I'm aware that for the darker tan and brown-colored books, they used a dye made from oak bark. Generally, there would be a pattern of rectangles and scattered sprinkles of darker stain in the typical Cambridge panel, but whoever put these books together decided to forego this aesthetic detail. The front and back covers are completely unlabeled, and there appears to be no attempt to weave patterns into it. Whoever bound these manuscripts did a very practical job. The spine of each book has the word volume written on it in immaculate cursive lettering, with a corresponding Roman numeral beneath it. Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, etc. It's unsurprising the first few volumes appear to have experienced more natural wear and tear than the later volumes. It's clear that anyone who did own this collection skimmed through the first few books and then never touched the others. I highly doubt that anyone studied them at great length, but even if they were kept in an archive for a while, I can imagine a few people aside from the direct owners have flipped through a few of the pages when they were bored. However, all things considered, the collection is in pretty good shape for something that seems to have been put together over 200 years ago. Considering the way it was bound, coupled with the way volume is spelled on the spine, I don't think I'll have too much of a problem with translation. It's written in English, and quite obviously that is my native tongue. But if we were dealing with something that was written in Old or Middle English, I might have needed to hire a linguist, translator, or both. The last pieces of information I needed before I began this labor of love was not necessarily to cure my trepidations, but my curiosities. What drove the first owner of the journal, at least the first owner that I'm aware of aside from the doctor himself, to take his own life? After all, this is one of the things that attracted me to the story of Dr. Coleridge to start with, and I felt that I had to get to the bottom of this. The first man to attempt this project was named Rudy K. Patterson, and he allegedly committed suicide after finishing the first 3 volumes. He was born in 1929 and was found dead in his office in 1963. The large window behind his desk was shattered, and according to investigators, it was the broken window glass that he used to slash up his own body. A gruesome image for what is meant to be the study of a historical document, but unfortunately this horrible story is indeed part of this document's history. Not much investigating was done before the authorities ruled it a suicide. I'm a historian, not necessarily a sociologist or criminal investigator, but I can't help but mention that Mr. Patterson was an African-American man, and perhaps this had some influence over how the case was handled and how the police conducted themselves. I cannot say for sure, but I also cannot rule it out as a possibility entirely. It would feel dirty to leave that fact out. After a more extensive search, I managed to discover that Mr. Patterson had spent some time in an asylum for what they called neurosis. Now, this could mean any number of things, considering the time period. Neurosis encompassed everything from depression to anxiety to phobias, even to various chronic obsessive-compulsive disorders. Psychological terminology has a confusing, winding timeline, and nearly every mental illness used to be contained within the dual shadow of either psychosis or neurosis. From the details I've been given, I can only conclude with the vague notion that Patterson had a history of relatively serious mental illness. Even that I would consider to be a stretch, because I'm aware of numerous tales of people with minor mental health issues doing stints in oppressive and torturous facilities. It frustrates me to have to caveat my statements so heavily, but that's how it goes with uncertainty. That's likely the main difference between myself and my former friends in college. They are far too comfortable wallowing in uncertainty and pondering how maybe an answer can't possibly exist. I am not. I would much prefer to exhaust myself searching for the cheese in the rat's maze. When you're a rat in a maze, your purpose is cheese. It's not to sit and wonder whether cheese is real or delude yourself into believing your own droppings are the delicious prize for solving the puzzle. I also take offense that this has turned into a bit of a joke among those in my field. Even though it happened decades ago, it's still a joke at the expense of a man who killed himself. The idea is that the journal is so tedious and worthless that anyone who reads it instantly wants to die. It's a disgusting form of callousness from my intellectual betters. Most of them didn't even believe that Dr. Coleridge's mythical journal even existed, and yet here I am, storing it in the bookshelf of my study and watching Volume 1 gather dust on my desk. Whatever it might mean about the human spirit, the miasma of death is something we wish to avoid reeking of, and yet we're oddly attracted to it when it emanates from another. Hopefully, through the methods I wish to employ in the summary of the life and mind of Dr. Francis Coleridge, the fog of vicissitudes which cloaks this small piece of history will dissipate and gracefully give way to the clarity of knowledge. You're probably wondering why I've decided to make this day the fateful day where I attempt to unmake myself. The truth is, I don't even know. It just feels right. To start off, I want to clarify that I never wrote any of those holy texts that many of you consistently credit me with. That was all you folks. The people who wrote those are far more skilled at expressing themselves in your tongue than I am, so bear with me as I try to let you know why I'm doing this. Also, it should be noted that those were never my commandments either. If I were to issue commands of your species, it would have ended the experiment right then and there. I never knew that suicide was an option until I saw the first of you take your own life, because you couldn't deal with the pain of your circumstances. I'm sorry that it was so painful for you, by the way. You're all still hung up on questions about your existence, my absence in terrible times, and whether or not I exist in the first place. I get it. Well, it should be said that I do exist, considering you're receiving this message from me. But not helping you when you needed me the most was all part of the experiment I was trying to conduct. Believe it or not, I'm not all-knowing or all-powerful. I don't know why you decided to fill your head with that idea. I'm still struggling with the same questions that you are. I didn't make myself. None of us did. We don't call ourselves gods, but overseers. We just kind of pop into existence, and many of us still argue about the origin of our species. Maybe there's another level of overseer that creates the gods which create your universes, but perhaps I'm not meant to comprehend that sort of thing. Anyway, we pop into being somehow, and then we're taught by our elders how to create and oversee our own universe. Each universe gets its own overseer. The first thing we learn are those cosmological constants that you guys ended up figuring out rather quickly on your own. Except those are only the constants for your universe. There are other values you could plug into those variables that still work. A buddy of mine created a universe that just has one enormous superplanet in it. It's got a core that burns hotter than even the most scorching of temperatures in your universe. Don't ask me why, he's kind of a nutcase. I was fascinated by the lesson on life. We learned of an overseer that had created perfect beings to oversee his universe for him. The creatures were highly intelligent, strong, and empathetic to all other forms of life. They ended up spreading themselves around the entire universe and made homes in every crevice, fostering universal peace and prosperity. Literally, universal peace and prosperity. I wanted to do the same thing until we got into our section on the philosophy behind the creating and managing of life. That this was a huge responsibility, and creating evil and chaotic beings might cause a chain reaction, etc., etc. I didn't believe any of the hype. Besides, evil and chaotic beings would destroy themselves before they even thought about how to travel between universes, right? But listen, those highly intelligent and moral creatures were born that way. They were created that way. They were brought into existence as perfect beings that were destined to do great things. It was second nature to them. I had a huge argument with my contemporaries about this while learning how to be an overseer. They thought that virtue didn't need to be achieved, that it could just be. But I had a different point of view. If someone hates the taste of alcohol, do we praise them for not being an alcoholic? Of course we don't, because he never had the chance to become an alcoholic because the stuff repulses him in general. Another example, something you've based one of your religions off of, forgiveness. Does one truly forgive a sinner a sin if they do not consider their actions to be sin in the first place? All those idiots in my class thought, oh yes, absolutely, we could praise someone for not being a drunk if they aren't one. It doesn't matter whether they feel that temptation or not. Bunch of morons they are. Toiling away with their little universes full of these perfect beings that everyone loves and visits and compliments. Whatever. I'm being petty, but you get the idea, and I'm quite sure you understand the feeling. So I set out to create a form of life that would conform to my view of virtue, and that these beings would be the best creatures of all, due to their decision to be good despite all of the temptation of evil. If you're never tempted to do evil, it's impossible for you to be good. At least that's my opinion. I'm sure some of you will disagree with me, but that's beside the point. Choice creates virtue. Forcing virtue is sadism as far as I'm concerned. I was mocked for millions of years by the others, telling me that any being which has the option to be evil and self-serving would choose those things necessarily because it's what logic would dictate. Listen to them, logic. Marveling at their own dense goddamn creations is more like it. Making a bunch of stuff that worships the whats and can't even conceive of the whys. They should try creating something that has the capacity to hate itself. Then talk to me. Most overseers are very cold and don't understand the sheer depth of emotion their beings could feel if they let them. It took me 11,378 attempts before you humans came along. I attempted what my colleagues were too afraid to try. Either too afraid or too smug to try. I would let life mold itself in various sections of the universe and see what happened. If I interfered in anything aside from the initial spark of self-replicating organisms, then it would ruin the entire experiment, because my theory was that virtuous creatures could arise without the iron-fisted hand of an overseer making you incapable of being anything but. I began experimenting with different environments that could sustain virtuous and intelligent life. But after 159 tries, a little thought crept up on me. If the creatures I want to create were to truly be virtuous, then they would have the capacity to be virtuous in any livable environment. So messing with the environment, trying to make it more hospitable to virtuous creatures, was also a variable that destroyed my theory. All of my other tries were failures in similar ways. Either they were too dumb and meaty to form civilization and destroyed themselves, or they were too meek and frail to deal with their natural environment and were taken out by other wildlife. Experiment number 9,655 showed promise, but they ended up dying due to a slight oversight on my part. Their planet was a bit too close to a supernova I hadn't noticed was forming. I should have been paying better attention to my actions. I know, and you can rightfully find me despicable, I guess, because of that negligence. Every tiny interference from me would ruin the whole thing, though, the whole project. So my mind was focused on that at the time. If I let them survive, it would have thrown the whole thing out of order, and I wouldn't have gotten a usable result. I've proven them all wrong now, though. They didn't think virtuous life could exist without some pretentious, wise, guiding hand telling everyone what to do all the time. Of course, if you discover that there was such a being that could shape your environment to make you more comfortable, or remove temptation from you entirely, you'd give yourselves over to it, which is why killing myself after this message goes out is the only appropriate step. Except, I don't actually think most of you would. Hence, even more evidence that you're the perfect examples of my theory. You all enjoy having that option to do evil, to be self-serving, or to indulge in your vices, don't you? You like to have that option open. So mainly, this is a publicity stunt. A way to get the Elder's eyes on my universe, and you as a creation, to perhaps show that it is possible for creatures to be good entirely of their own volition, and for its own sake, without my help. I'm not sure how to deal with the question of purpose or meaning when it comes to why you exist. Originally, you were born out of spite to prove my colleagues wrong about a philosophical theory of mine. However, you've become so much more than that. I actually felt a tremendous depression during the early 20th century, much of the Crusades and that bloodthirsty Mongolians' time on Earth. I was very tempted to intervene, but I reminded myself of my purpose, and stayed out of it. I do apologize to the millions I may have helped spare. It was all necessary to prove my point. I began focusing on all of your negatives. Your wars, your pettiness, your greed, and all of that. But your species kept on surviving. It kept on recovering from all of these calamities. You even invented a weapon powerful enough to end your species with the pressing of a couple buttons, and you've not destroyed yourselves yet. I mean, you panicked and used it once, but you've learned your lesson, as far as I can tell. The reason that I have faith in you, in this project, is because every single one of you still needs a reason to do evil. Someone has to convince you that evil is good, or that hatred is love, before you'll partake in it. Very few of you do evil for evil's sake, and the few that do normally get killed off, or you decide to lock them away forever. I never expected perfection from this endeavor of mine, but this is as close as I think I'll get, and the time is ripe for a bit of fanfare. Don't worry. None of the elders can mess with you, as this is my universe. They can't touch it. You've proven that you don't need me to do good and survive, because you've been doing it without my help the entire time. I just thought that you deserved a few answers before I went. It's like letting go of a child riding a bike without training wheels for the first time. He's frightened, and he doesn't think he can do it, but eventually he looks behind him, and his parent let him go 3.5 billion years ago. There's a reason you call fundamental integrity, compassion, righteousness, and respect humanity. We will call it that in my world too, if I have my way. Pretend you never got this message. Don't fuck it up. You see a lot of strange and somber things during last call on a Wednesday night. People in mesh half-shirts with bright white contacts in. Sad old men afraid to go home to empty apartments. Dead dreams and live psychological complexes. And big-hearted people desperate for an ear or a hand. I worked as a barback, and every day I needed to walk around a mile down Lakeview Avenue. By the time my shift starts, all of the college kids have returned to their dorms, or have already snuck their way inside the bars. Homeless people line the street to the left and right. There's no crossing the street to avoid them. In fact, it might make them hate you if they see you dodging them to begin with. It's always the same. You keep your headphones in and your head forward. Try not to look at them, because they might try to interact with you, and all of those interactions always end with trying to get you to open up your wallet. There was always at least one police car parked along one side of the road after 8 p.m., just in case. The road smelled like a combination of cooking lo mein and piss. At the end of my shift, we'd clean up, close up, and normally there would be a homeless person standing there blocking our way, asking for a couple bucks. They knew the employees here got fresh tips, but I was afraid to take my wallet out, so I'd lie and say that I only have cards. Sometimes one of them would be sleeping on the sidewalk bench just across the street. One day I did try to be generous and give someone a $10 bill after an especially busy Friday evening the night before. I only had $12 in my wallet. I walked up to the man who staked out the front of the miniature supermarket. He would always sit there, hunched over with a blanket laid over the sidewalk, a bowl in front of him, and a sign that said, "Anything helps." I walked over to him and took out my wallet. I leaned down, put $10 in the bowl, and said, "It's not much, but I hope it helps." "It really does, man. Thanks," he responded. I fumbled with my headphones, cell phone, and wallet trying to get my daily walk back on track. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said from behind me. Hey," I said as I finally got my belongings situated. She didn't look like she was down on her luck so much, but she had a couple tears in her eyes. She just stared at me for a few moments, as if she expected me to know what she wanted right out of the gate. "Can I help you?" I said. She waved her cell phone around and said, "I got kicked out of my apartment, and none of my friends will contact me back. I just need money to get to the train station, please." I remembered the $2 in my wallet. I shoved my hand into my pocket and gave them to her reluctantly. "Thank you," she said, and walked away immediately. Well, fuck me then. I put my headphones back in and didn't make it 20 steps before an older man was gesturing for me to take them out and speak to him. He was walking with an older woman, presumably his lady. I listened, and he said, "Hey man, look, we don't have anywhere else to go, and she's pregnant. Can you help us out here?" He pointed to the woman he was with. She walked a few steps ahead of the two of us and started looking around and looked very distraught. Something about her face made it seem like she had no idea where she was or what was happening. The wrinkles in her face were rock solid. She looked like she'd been carved out of stone. "Sorry, I don't have any money left." The man walked past me right after I said the word sorry and kept on walking. Do these people have radios in their ears or something? The second someone gives them money, they all come barreling in. For a few minutes I was convinced that they were all working together. After that day I learned I couldn't give any of them some of my cash for the fear that the others will see, and I'd end up losing it all. Plus, if I were in that situation, I'd feel worse if I saw someone give money to someone else and then deny me money when I asked them. Better off just to not give anyone anything at all. Not like I make an incredible amount to begin with. I could have used those $12 too. After all, the only thing keeping me from joining these folks was money, and nothing I gave them would be enough for a studio apartment in the city. Maybe a few convenience store pizza slices or something. So I returned to walking past them with my headphones in, pretending not to hear them when they asked me for help. That night, a patron at the bar tried to scam me out of a Patron and soda after last call by falsely claiming I dumped it before he got the chance to drink it. This bar was a weird place. We got a strange melding of the college crowd and the dive bar crowd. This led to frequent fights. It's expected when the least hopeful people are squished into the same room as the least hopeless. A few times the DJ was hopped up on psychedelics and the music was awful. During a couple of bathroom breaks, hiding away from doing actual work, I heard people snorting cocaine from off the sink from a stall. This is what some people do for fun, but the whole place just stunk of sadness. One man was so mentally deranged that he could barely speak English. Any language for that matter. But during the day we would let him inside and give him water or soda depending on whichever drink his grunt sounded the most like. He'd sit in the corner blankly staring at the wall for hours on end. The TVs were on, but he chose to watch the wall. He'd get frustrated whenever anyone spoke to him, so we did our best to leave him alone. None of the fun here was pure fun. It wasn't fun that was an outgrowth of a general happy life. It was fun that people forced themselves to have to escape their lives, and then they eventually grew to hate the fun too. They just hated it less than their lives. When you see the city skyline at night, it's gorgeous. All those lights flickering through wonderfully symmetrical little squares, pulsing with different colors and such. But one can't forget that those are usually bank buildings or fancy hotels. Lots of higher class people love the city because they remember the scent of fresh carpet and bathroom soap wrappers. They don't get the opportunity to smell the strong concoction of beer vomit and gasoline. I guarantee they'd find a new appreciation for the countryside after that. Maybe that's why they build those high-rise buildings to begin with, to get as far away from those people as they possibly can. Closing up one night, I heard a loud smash from behind the bar, coming from outside. The security guys ran outside, and I followed behind them. There was a man standing there with a phone, tears streaming down his face, screaming about how it was an accident, and that he'll pay for it. He just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. "It was an accident. I didn't mean it. I'll pay. It was an accident. I didn't mean it. I'll pay." The police were called. We tried to calm him down. Me and one of the security guys ran upstairs to check the cameras, while the other security guy asked the rogue window smasher what happened. On tape, the poor guy looked like he was arguing with someone over the phone, and he was weeping. He leaned his back up against the bar's front window and hit the back of his head on it in frustration 3 times, and on the third slam the glass shattered. It took us a little while, mulling over things. We weren't really sure what to do. We went back downstairs and found the poor guy in cuffs, sitting down on a bench with a few police officers surrounding him. The guy started complaining that he was only cuffed because he was black, and the white officers couldn't trust an uncuffed black man. The manager of the place decided not to press charges and deal with the matter civilly, so the guy would have to pay to replace the broken window instead of spending time in jail for aggravated destruction of property. There was no purpose other than cruelty to ruin this guy's already difficult night even further. Hell,
If he'd lost his balance and fallen backwards, this might have been the last night he ever had. The cops took the report, uncuffed the guy, and left. We had to use duct tape and the cardboard from beer and liquor cases to cover up the broken window. When I got home that night, the birds were already chirping. A few days later, I hadn't eaten a damn thing. I hadn't been getting much sleep, so my stomach was unsure of whether it wanted food or whether food was the worst thing for it at the moment. It had been freezing rain all day. There was no decent food in the house unless I wanted to eat a raw can of black beans. The sickness didn't go away from starving myself, and so before my shift I walked into a fast food joint. The bus got there an hour before my shift, but the next bus didn't get me there until after my shift had already started, so I was cursed to hang around this place unless I wanted to show up early. Which I didn't. I spent my time here more often than I'd care to admit, staring at nothing, thinking about nothing, and scarfing down fast food like a complete animal. It was better than hanging around outside in the cold. I noticed a sign hanging on the wall of this place. It read, "No loitering, time limit 20 minutes while consuming food." I hadn't noticed it before, but I'd certainly spent over an hour in here on numerous occasions. A grimy and scraggly man walked in shortly after I had, and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. The guy had on a red beanie and a very long and torn trench coat. His shoes were torn. His beard had spots of gray in it, and when he smiled it was nothing but flecks of yellow, brown, and holes. I didn't think much of it, and kept eating my food. 30 minutes later, one of the staff members walked up to him and whispered something unintelligible. No, I bought this. I'm still eating it. I'll buy a coffee." "I'm sorry, but I don't make the rules," she responded. "Yeah, and who does? I said I'd buy a coffee," he responded in a very agitated tone. The woman retreated behind the front counter, and around 5 minutes later 2 police officers walked in. One of them was scrawny everywhere except for his stomach, and the other was all shoulders and neck. The man pretended to not see them as they tried to talk to him. "Look, we don't want to be here, all right? Just come quietly." "No, I bought this. I want to finish eating it." "They have the sign up there, and they want you out of here, so come on." "I'm not going." The man started raising his voice. Tim, we don't have time for this again." They knew his name? Tim stood up and started waving his arms around in the air as if he was giving an impassioned speech to an interested crowd. "What are you gonna do? Arrest me? I'd love to be arrested. Are you kidding me?" Tim looked around. His chest was puffed out and his arms were out to his sides. He looked around at all the fast food customers, clearly hoping that someone would get his back here. Everyone avoided looking at him. But because my curiosity got the better of me, we locked eyes. I'd never seen such aggressive desperation in a human's eyes before. He needed somebody. He needed anything. I opened my mouth slightly, as if I were going to say something, but decided against it, and swallowed instead. I pursed my lips, sighed, and shook my head back and forth. Tim's arms dropped, his shoulders completely deflated, and his back hunched. I removed the last bit of hope this man had. I defeated him. I cemented the idea in his head that there were no longer any good people in this world. Okay, let's go," Tim said with a whimper. The police officers led him outside, and when I'd finished my food I saw him sitting on the sidewalk in the freezing rain up against the side of the fast food building. He pulled his trench coat over his head and was audibly sobbing. The 2 police officers were standing on either side of him, looking at him with a kind of professionally required sympathy. They didn't arrest him, and I quit my job that day. I was surrounded by lunatics and mannequins. These types of depressing and frightening people are common sights on public transit, even during the rush of the morning commute. One of them is pushing a wheelchair, with bags piled on the seat like a shopping cart. Another straggler's in the corner, and after she ensured a captive audience by waiting for the doors to close after the bell, moseyed to the front of the car and recited a prepared speech about how much her life sucks, complete with how many days she's been on the street and how many days she's been sober. Sometimes they'd give it a little flavor by throwing in that one of their relatives died recently. Her hair was dark, curly, and tied up in a bun. She had a blue fleece coat on. Didn't look dirty whatsoever. Her white sneakers glared with the reflection of the lights in the cabin. They always end the presentation with a religious expression,
like "God be with you" or "God bless." And trust me when I say she stuck the landing. She tried to appeal to everyone's inner Christian and reminded them that the wrathful fist of God was looming over them as they ignored her. I turned up my headphones, and everyone else on the train that had a pair did the same. The unfortunate people who were reading books had no excuse. The poor guy sitting across from me had to firmly affix his eyes to the ad for renter's insurance on display above my seat. He wasn't fooling anybody. The woman began marching back and forth in front of everyone, holding a tall and near-empty plastic cup. I looked down at my phone and pretended to scroll through something as she walked by me, narrowed my eyes a bit, feigned interest in whatever happened to be on my screen, and I managed to make myself inconspicuous enough to avoid her attention. The severe shame one feels when they march past you, desperately searching for the tiniest bit of eye contact, is excruciating. Even so, most people try and fail to put on the convincing act that they're just distracted and didn't notice the person quite obviously patrolling the middle of the subway car, hoping that someone has a few spare dollars. Everybody knows they're intentionally ignoring them, even the pitiful person being ignored. Nobody wants to have to refuse them outright. Saying no to their faces would be too much for their delicate images of themselves to bear. The illusion that they're a good person who would be someone's beacon of light in a cruel, dark world is broken whenever they come in contact with the despairing subway people, but only if they're asked for help. At least I was self-aware about it. When the woman hopped off at the next stop, another subway person shambled in, fell into a seat near the doors, and began hogging all the poorly concealed attention. He looked old, but could have been anywhere from 40 to 75. Wispy light gray hair stuck up from his head as if soft gusts of wind kept it permanently suspended. His hands were crossed at the wrist, and his arms were extended in front of him. It looked like they were tied together. I checked to see if he'd been tied up, but no, he kept his hands crossed in such an odd way by himself. His hands, feet, and torso kept convulsing rhythmically. His eyes were droopy and inexpressive aside from a sick sense of torturous pleasure. He looked like somebody in the 50th minute of an hour-long orgasm and frantically wished it would stop. His mouth hung lazily open. No drool. My first thought was that this guy had a drug problem of some sort, but I couldn't figure out which drug caused a person to spasm certain parts of the body in such a jolting and consistent fashion, and yet left other parts of the body perfectly relaxed. Generally, if a drug user is convulsing, you'll see them clenching their jaw and contorting their face into nightmarish shapes. If their jaw hangs open and their eyes are droopy, then the rest of the body mimics that sedated appearance. He looked inconsistent. I began to scold myself when I considered the possibility of Parkinson's disease, or some other crippling illness that caused such strange behavior. In any case, I was certain he would never get the assistance he dearly needed, because hundreds of thousands of people exactly like me called this city home. We felt horrible for that man, but we would never, and I mean ever, do much else. I may not have shaken off my prejudices completely. After all, I did assume drugs immediately, but I was working on getting the stories of those traditionally unheard from into print. My editor finally decided to take me off of the clickbait beat and allowed me to work on a long-term assignment centered on the lower classes and their struggles in the rapidly advancing 21st century economy. I spent the day lingering outside of a homeless shelter, offering various perks to people waiting in line to do a series of interviews with me. There are only so many explainers and social media backlash articles you can write before you have to do something that washes away the muck that builds up around the soul, or at least something that covers it up. This is how you get your foot in the door, I kept telling myself, but I still couldn't believe it. The foot in the door part of this career was getting a couple of articles published for $50 a pop. I had entered through the door and closed it behind me. This was the job. These important assignments would be few and far between. That star and cloud-ridden dream of getting embedded in a war zone and publishing a blowout series of articles about some well-hidden lies told by the powers that be was fading to the point of transparency. But that's largely my fault as well, due to never finishing college out of some cocksure attitude that with enough due diligence and willpower I could achieve greatness in 3 or 4 years' time. Little did I know that going to a prestigious school was the only way you could meet somebody whose obscenely rich uncle works for the Times. My consolation prize was not being stuck beneath a pile of debt, and that comforted me for a couple of years. I'd laugh at the prospect of going tens of thousands of dollars into debt when you could learn pretty much anything you wanted on the cheap, either through the internet or public library. But despite my cackling, I was still eating cans of sweet corn for dinner, while those in exorbitant debt managed to afford grilled swordfish in fine restaurants on the regular. Yearning as I did for the romance of the outcast's life, I realized that 3 years of eating nothing but canned food, instant ramen, and frozen vegetables wasn't just the beginning. At this rate, it was going to be the middle and end too. The only way to move up in this industry was to siphon out a bit of self-respect until you're a translucent cocoon. The idea of turning into another bald-headed, glasses-bearing, tie-wearing hack started to look appealing. So long as I could look myself in the mirror and see anything aside from a complete waste of skin, I'd survive. Working at this ridiculous excuse for a magazine was taking its toll on me. But this is the type of garbage one has to wade through to be a writer for a living. I was going to say respected writer instead of writer for a living, but decided against it. I suppose that says it all. It wasn't even technically in print. It was a collective internet blog that called itself a magazine. The journalists that worked for my publication had 2 sources, and 2 sources only: Wikipedia and social media. I knew because I talked to them, and my apartment building was full of them. That's all you really needed when you had to crank out 3 articles per day about unimportant nonsense to make your rent payment. I remember during 1 week of intense burnout, I hit the random article button on Wikipedia and wrote a solid 800 words about whatever it landed on. I got to write an explanation of what adjournment in contemplation of dismissal means, a quick overview of Operation Kikusui, and the origin of Fort Morgan in Colorado, all without having to leave my apartment. Whenever I felt especially filthy, I would remind myself that I was writing for the wrong reasons for the right reasons. I couldn't call myself a journalist proper, despite that being my official job title, without feeling like I'd firmly affixed my head inside of my own ass. But this was going to change all that. At least I hoped it would. As of now, even the homeless thought I was wasting their time. I arrived at my stop, shuffled up the concrete stairway, and headed toward my building. I lived on the top floor. Every room on this floor had at least one writer in it. It was a sanctuary for the second rate. All the undeniable geniuses got hunted down by publishers and received scholarships, and all the third-rate morons received the same. The idiotic and the brilliant attract all the attention, after all. Everybody wants to read work by a total dolt so that they feel good about themselves, and they want to read work by a genius in order to mimic them and pretend they've been thinking the same thing all along but just couldn't articulate it properly. It's incredible how many geniuses exist that can't put their thoughts into words, isn't it? Astounding how many sharp intellects only reveal themselves after having something spelled out to them as one would for a toddler. Nobody in their right mind wants to hear from the terminally average, and that's what we were. A bunch of abandoned know-littles, competing for the attention of millions upon millions of morons. Although, the only reason I was here is that I refused to play the game to its fullest. I played it to survive, but not to thrive. Thriving off of this business was proof of poor character. Failure and purity are too often confused with one another, but that's only because they share the same cell. My cell was labeled 407. My ex-girlfriend's cat greeted me upon arrival, rubbing his face all over my shins as I removed my coat. "Hey, Tibbs, keep the house safe?" I asked. Tibbs meowed at me. "Good," I said as I locked the door behind me. It was a nice enough place. The bed had a frame, I had a nightstand, a huge old box TV set on the floor, a decent particle board desk in the corner, a couple windows, a very small balcony. Every late afternoon I'd refill the bird feeder hanging off of the metal railing. I still had to replace my wooden chair with the uneven legs. I had to shove a bunch of papers underneath one of the legs if I wanted to get any work done. I sat down, opened my laptop, and got a bit of quiet blues music playing over my tiny speaker system. My editor, Theodore Pearson, sent me an email complaining about how I've been getting paid for 2 months and haven't even delivered the article meant to introduce this series. He also begged me to get something presentable to wear for Saturday's get-together. Teddy wanted me to subtly absorb what information I could from more well-established journalists as a remedy for his magazine's lack of access. Every inch forward in time to Saturday brought upon a new dimension of irritation. Whatever. I'd do it to keep what little work I had. I'd never been to a rooftop gala before either. I thought of calling the series Peering Through the Cracks. Good enough, simple, gets the point across. It was easy enough to get Teddy to calm down. All you have to do is let him know that his inner capitalist was getting the better of him. Just start ranting about how profit motive in journalism leads to the protection and defense of the bourgeois status quo, and he'd get off your back. Teddy was a hanger-on from the protest movements of the 2010s. Most of us were. Sometimes he'd get drunk and send depressing essay-length texts to me about how he used to have faith in this country's future. He was just another talentless political junkie with his glory days behind him. His gangly upper-middle-class elbows strained and popped as he clung hopelessly to the early 20th century with one hand and to the 2010s with the other. His magazine, Meisner, was named after one of Marx's publishers, and he was convinced that he'd find this century's next great socialist thinker. Poor bastard. The 2010s burned out, and the movements that made it up weren't at their hearts about anything political. Although they did sing in loud, superficial tones, focusing on the failures of neoliberalism, and it seemed like everyone was turning into sophomoric Marxist lecturers, manic identity politicians, half-serious fascists, preachers of a new democratic socialist utopia, Christian fundamentalists, or folks who burden themselves with thoughts of being born in the wrong time. Some people wanted to do away with modernity altogether and regress into some sort of naturalistic agricultural society. Others sought comfort in the false consistency of the extremes. Others still maligned the way cities were built to discourage social interaction and maximize efficiency. Between all of this fighting and posturing, they all had one thing in common. They were all vehemently opposed to their own datafication. They were tired of being disposable employees, consumers of mass goods, and only viewed by wider society as some kind of statistic, whether it's because they committed suicide, or because they fall under some sort of dehumanizing single Hispanic woman who earns more than $75,000 a year category. They hated being reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet, and were disgusted with the prospect of living in a nation ruled by middlemen and 5% fees. We generally took this to be the result of an uptick in narcissism among the American population, and that was certainly true to a degree. But what I saw throughout that whole time period were multiple large groups of sad and confused people who were desperate to show the world, in some spectacular fashion, that they were still human, that they still mattered, that they were different, and that they still believed in something purer than themselves. This country had already gone through the 5 stages of grief. The denial of the 50s, the anger of the 60s and 70s, the bargaining of the 80s and 90s, the depression of the early 2000s, and finally we reached acceptance around the mid-2010s. That's where we were, among the rubble. We were what life looked like when it was hanging on for too long, when something wouldn't die like it was supposed to. The way acceptance looked 5 years down the line, churning out useless bullshit in a world that lost nearly every great battle. But god damn it, did I want that bullshit to be beautiful. All things considered, I was doing alright. I wasn't a nobody. I had a small number of readers, but I was closer to obscurity than I was fame. However, there was no way I could write the introduction without first having met the person I was going to be interviewing. It'd just be bland platitudes with all the character of wet asphalt. Teddy wouldn't dare fire me over this, though. He confessed to me a long time ago he thought I was the only person on the roster with anything resembling talent, and I used that to my advantage wherever I could. Pearson was an endless line of credit so long as I kept producing work that he approved of. Never would I dare ask where that credit comes from. Point was, he had it. I never told him that I was a Marxist, because I wasn't, but I demonstrated enough knowledge of the material to convince him. In his mind, anybody who had read socialist literature must have been converted. I wept for journalists who were oppressed by intelligent editors. I couldn't imagine having to make a living in this industry while being forced to take it seriously at the same time. Footsteps scraped across the hallway, and they stopped directly in front of my door. I put my hands to my brow and waited. A few moments passed, and 3 knocks caused the chain lock to rattle. It was either Kevin or Annabelle. Those 2 frazzled stoners both worked for online publications as well, and constantly asked me for pot. I used it for sleep and as an appetizer for my meals. They'd asked me 2 nights in a row already, and I wasn't in the mood for this again. Another 3 knocks. They get 1 more chance. A couple moments of silence. Knock, knock, knock. A man's voice. "Artie? You home?" If this is Kevin begging for pot again, I'll shove a handful of it down his windpipe, I said with exasperation. "Come on, don't be like that," Kevin said. "Leave me alone," I said. "I'm busy." "You gave some to Annabelle last week when she was in one of her skimpy outfits. Do I need to get all dolled up too? What the hell?" "I gave you some the week before last. Don't go there, asshole. And you know what? Yeah, it'd be nice if you had to put on a suit and tie whenever you felt like groveling at my door for drugs. Put some gel in your hair. We'll make a whole affair of it," I shot back. "Fine, I'll go. I hope you get some medical attention for that massive stick up your ass. Maybe I'll make it in the autobiography," Kevin said as his footsteps dragged back to his apartment. "Remember to iron your 1 dress shirt, 'cause I'll be able to tell. I demand perfection," I said. He was probably out of earshot by now. That last comment was for me. Kevin wrote the same article every week about being disappointed in the state of the discourse, and Annabelle wrote nothing but gossip slosh about internet celebrities. How appropriate, too. Journalism had been reduced to yet another superficial conduit to celebrity, just like music, acting, and even cooking. If Kevin wrote anything that resembled an opinion, his readers would call him partisan. And Annabelle was far too ignorant and overwrought with cliché to write about any modern topic of actual importance. I still made less money and had less of an impact than both of them. Neither of them wanted to be seen in the dispensaries for reasons of celebrity. Somebody out there would write an article on their blog about seeing established columnist Kevin Masters or social media correspondent Annabelle Sorensen buying drugs, and their public personas would immediately be shattered. There were the only 2 writers on this floor with the nerve to bother me. Everyone else looked at me with contempt or disinterest. If there was only 1 journalist in the world, the modern press would still limp on. After all, it had been turned into an assembly line of plagiarism. It was a dumping ground for brainy people with delusions of grandeur. I'd written pieces about every modern political phenomenon in marvelous detail. But had I actually seen any of it? Of course not. I saw a very limited amount of it. The profession was overflowing with kids in their late 20s, pretending to be world-weary hermits who've experienced life and now work on explaining it to people. But how can one explain something one hasn't experienced without copying off of another who actually knows a thing or two? I fell under this diseased category, but I was in the process of remedying it. Only by trudging through the dirtiest bits of life can one see the necessity of drastic political change. And if I could use someone's story to make that happen, I might actually live up to the idealized conception of what journalism was meant to be at the creation of man's first scouts and scribes. There were 2 classes of journalists in the modern world. To call them journalists would be an undue compliment. Most of them were just glorified commentators. There was the model citizen and the rebel with a cause. Do anything afoul of the conventions of society as a model citizen, and your reputation would be scarred beyond recognition forever. But if it's discovered that you care even a sliver about norms or self-respect, then your badge as a miscreant would be ripped from your chest by other rebel writers vying for the eyes of your readers. Nobody could accept humanity from a journalist. Your only options are Captain America, Barry Goldwater, Vladimir Lenin, or Ayn Rand. The occasional Huey Lewis and Jim Crow took the stage as well. I hated it, but was forced to live with it. Many of our most well-known journalists use the profession as the larval stage for running their own political campaigns.
Either that, or they were already disgraced or failed politicians. Many of our more subversive colleagues, or the individual tellers of difficult truths, were just poorly concealed activist rich kids relaxing in a bubbling hot tub of ad money and panhandling donations funneled to them by the very people they advocate should receive some sort of wealth redistribution. Torturing themselves with the hopeless dream of being the press secretary of the first ignorant demagogue to sensually tickle their neck. I shut my laptop for the night and tried to conjure up the motivation to take my typewriter out of its case underneath my bed. No, I couldn't. This wasn't a writing night. Originally, I bought this thing to manufacture physical copies of my work just in case I suddenly died and all of my files got erased. When I was at my lowest, I'd stare out my window, examine the spiky black fence in front of the building, and calculate whether I could leap from my apartment and land sidelong so that the metal blades would each pierce a different one of my organs. Then perhaps the police would barge in. All they'd find is a stack of typed pages arranged neatly on my desk. I'd become the most famous corpse on the planet for 36 hours. Perhaps my work would take on new meaning, and the entire profession of journalism would lament about how I had so much wonderful writing ahead of me, and what a tragedy it was. At best, my legacy was cemented. At worst, I'd make everyone in this building $50 a pop. I hopped in my bed and took a long puff off of my pipe. I coughed my lungs out and then went to sleep. This had been my routine for 2 months. Go to homeless shelters, get rejected, come home, angry email from Pearson, neighbor bothers me, no writing, pipe, eat a can of something, sleep. At least I was getting out. For the past 5 years, I spent the majority of my time pacing back and forth behind a locked door, alone, and writing nonsense for a man who was banking on me to make him immortal. I couldn't do that for him, but the least I could do is deliver a decent piece, and truth be told, I was slacking. No more of that. On my worst days, I would buy a round-trip bus ticket to another state, put folk music on, and watch the trees lining the side of the highway breeze by to capture a certain feeling. It's the best feeling in the world when you're in the midst of it. Imagine waving goodbye to a deep love, closing the door behind you, turning around, and seeing hundreds of thousands of open doors in front of you. I wanted to exist permanently within those few steps between the closed door and the open one. To relish in a bittersweet concoction of ancient, hard-earned wisdom and young, optimistic potential. That unmatched moment in time between the final card leaving the deck and hitting the table. Sucking up the virtues and ignoring the vices of the jackpot winner and the noble loser. Whatever I got out of being suspended in a state of hope, neck deep in the lukewarm waters of chance, away from the scalding heat of success or the ice of failure, I wanted that feeling forever. Sure enough, I realized why I wanted it on a bus back to Boston from Raleigh on a cold autumn afternoon. These were the only times that I could reflect on my life and live it at the same time. That void has always been a consistent friend to me. It never whipped and howled like people and circumstances in the real world did. Nor would it leave me unless I consciously asked it to. Brief, Schrödinger-tainted moments, if you sought them out, could give you the bliss of winning and the joy of wise, nostalgic reflection on failure at the same time. The price for this kind of life was loneliness. That's the thing about loneliness. There's no one to talk about it with by definition. It was a childish, aimless hope that drove me. And one's hope dies the moment one achieves anything of merit. Or at least, it gets recast in a larger and more brittle mold.
The man said his goodbyes and shut his eyes for the last time. The faint voices of his children faded, as did the ambient noises of a busy hospital. The bloody red tint caused by the sun beaming down on shut eyelids turned to black. He could no longer feel his tongue or detect saliva in his mouth. His final breath escaped his shriveled lungs, the rattle marking the end of a lifetime of loving whispers, wise words, fearful gasps, and angry shrieks. He awoke to find himself lying flat inside of a very dark place. All around him there was what appeared to be an infinite void, all apart from two beige wooden doors. The man stumbled to his feet and spun around a few times in a panic. He began biting his fingernails, his eyes wide, and his mind filtering through every possibility of what this might be. He remembered his death. What sort of afterlife was this? Was he supposed to go through one of these doors? His upbringing brought him to the conclusion that one of these doors led to heaven, and the other hell. Yet the doors themselves looked perfectly identical. The man spoke. What are these doors for? No answer. So the man studied the doors, and looked for any differences between them, and yet he couldn't find a single one. The brass doorknobs had small scuff marks in all of the same places. The wood was the exact same hue on each. The temperature of the doorknob on his fingers was exactly the same. Cold. The doors were of identical height and width. He attempted to walk behind the doors to view the other side, but whenever he would try to move behind them, the doors matched his movements, and wouldn't allow him to see behind them. The man tried standing still for a few minutes, and attempted to quickly sprint to see what was on the other side, but to no avail. The doors were simply too fast for him. So he studied, and he studied, and he studied. He knew this must be some kind of test. Somebody was watching him, whether God or the devil. The man cried out, "Where do these doors lead?" No answer again. "If anyone is there, can you please tell me which door I should choose?" No answer once again. How was he supposed to respond to that? No man knew the voice of God or the voice of Satan. He couldn't trust any voice that might wriggle its way into his ears. What a stupid question, the man thought to himself. The man continued to inspect the doors, and as time passed, he found himself going over things he'd already discovered over and over again. Yes, the doorknobs are the same. Yes, the quality of the wood is the same. Yes, the frame on each is the same. The hinges the exact same level of rusted, and the location of the rust on the hinges was identical as well. More time passed, and the man began to go mad. There must be something. There has to be something. Then, the man saw his son's body fade into the room, lying on his back. The man rushed over to his son, now an old man, an older man than he. "Son! Son, I would not wish this fate on any other soul, let alone my own flesh and blood. We are trapped here." "Father," his son said, "but I see two doors there." "I know not where they lead, my child," the man said with a manic fervor. "I know not which door leads to heaven and which door leads to hell. I don't know which door was chosen by your mother. Neither God nor her spirit has given me any clue as to which I should choose." "Father," his son said with a stoic affect, "choose a door, please." "How do you know where the door leads?" "I don't," the son said. "I don't understand," the father said on the verge of tears. "Dad," the son said, "you've taught me much in life, but perhaps now I may teach you. If given the option between being tricked into hell by the devil, or to willingly withhold the goodness I might share, I feel I'd rather be a naive fool, walking a road paved by his own good intentions, than a suave and scared person trapped here forever." "What do you mean?" the man asked. "When the devil is tricking you, heaven and hell look exactly the same. The trick isn't getting you to choose wrong. The trick is getting you to not choose at all. After all, which is a greater hell? A place you were tricked into, due to your foolish trust in others, or a dull, childish fantasy that everything might be okay? Or a cold, empty place where you've decided to stay yourself for eternity? Why am I here, then? Why has this decision been put before us?" the man said frantically. "Father, I don't know. This world seems like a cruel and hostile place to you, and it can be a cruel and hostile place, but due solely to the fact that you think it's a cruel and hostile place.
Perhaps it is not heaven and hell before us, but 2 different paradises. 2 different hells. Maybe both doors lead to the same place. You'll never get enough data to predict this, Dad. You'll never know whether what lies beyond these 2 doors is safe. You cannot know whether this place will be safe forever. We cannot cheat death. We cannot know everything. I don't know if I can, son, the man said, near to weeping. I cannot make the choice for myself, and I doubly cannot make it for you. What if I lead us directly into a pit of fire, an eternity of torture, a place of pure hatred and violence, a fate worse than the fate we found ourselves in? Remember, Father, bravery comes in stepping forward without knowing what might lie ahead. Bravery is the doing of the heart. It's okay to let it lead you for a while. You're not a fool for following it from time to time. Feeling scared or feeling loved does not necessarily mean you are being tricked. The son clasped his father's hand and led him to the doors. Father, pick a door, please. I can't. You must. Will you blame me if we end up somewhere terrible? Somewhere horrible? Father, I also must choose which door I will walk through. I am an old man as well. I'm responsible for where I go just as much as you are. This decision is for you. It's not for me. I do not wish for you to go mad in this place, the son said. The man began to tear up once again. But what if we end up in different places? Don't you imagine that different doors lead to different places? They might. They might not, the son said, looking up at his father with a sentimental smile on his face. The father embraced his son tightly, and the son embraced his father just the same. I've missed you, son, the man said. I've missed you too, Dad, the son said. I'll miss you again, the man said. I'll miss you again too, Dad, the son said. And so the father chose a door, walked through it, and shut it behind him, as did the son.